Oops. What'd you do? Oh, what's that? Aha. Follow the tracks. Where do the tracks lead? It could have been you then. Huh. Well, says you. Are we to believe that? Could be. That's how it was at our house one time. Not in Arcadia, but I went outside and we had a little place there in front of the house where there was, whenever it would rain, it would wash the sediment off like onto the sidewalk there. And one day I saw footprints through that and I thought, those are way too big to be my footprints. All right, open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. We'll sing all three verses. Oh, wait. Matthew 10 and verse 1. All right. Does anybody have any Bible questions today? Nope. Very good. In that case, let's get started. Matthew 10 and verse 1. This passage, by the way, do you know what it's usually called? The Limited Commission. But we're going to call it the Not So Limited Commission. And we'll see why around about verse 16 or so. All right? Matthew 10, verse 1. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. This puts us at a pre-cross time, right? Jesus is talking to them before the cross. How do we know that? Not just because it's chapter 10, but how else would we know that? Judas is mentioned there. But in Acts chapter 1, after the cross, Judas is gone, and he is replaced by the apostles there in Acts chapter 1. All right, so he says in verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, do not go in the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans. Now, how is that different from Acts chapter 1? What did Jesus tell them in Acts 1? Go into Jerusalem. What's next? Judea, Samaria, then to the uttermost parts of the earth. That's right. And so in Acts chapter 1, we have more of a broad commission there, but I'm going to show you why this one plays into that one here in a moment. He says in verse 6, instead he wants them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In Matthew 15 and 24, you have this woman, this Canaanite woman, the Syro-Phoenician woman, and she is wanting the Lord to have mercy on her. And the disciples say, send her away, because she keeps shouting at us. But Jesus answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so we see sort of a limited aspect of Jesus's ministry to begin with. But if you actually look and see what Jesus says next in Matthew 15, she cries out more and more in verse 27. And he says in verse 28, O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. And so it wasn't that Jesus was opposed to helping out the Gentiles. He already did that in Matthew chapter 8, right? With the servant of the centurion. But his primary purpose before the cross was to reach the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but they had rejected him. And so, here's what he says for them to do in verse 7. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, what did we call this message? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Do you remember? Yeah, we called it something. Yep. let me write it up here for you. It's called this in Matthew 4. Prophecy. Nope, not prophecy. Yep, the gospel of the kingdom. In Matthew 4, the text said that Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom, and then it says he went everywhere preaching the kingdom of heaven was at hand. And so the gospel of the kingdom, the good news, remember the good news is the good news concerning the kingdom. So the good news concerning the kingdom was that it was at hand. Let me show you a correlating passage to this. Look at Matthew 24 and verse 15 to see how long this message was to be preached. Rather, verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And so the gospel of the kingdom would, all right, let's draw out a timeline here just so we know. We have here the preaching of John the Baptist, we'll call him JB. We have here the fall of Jerusalem in 70. We have here the preaching of Jesus. We have the day of Pentecost, and then we have the conversion of the household of Cornelius. But see, a lot of people think that the message, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, stopped right about here, right? Because if the kingdom came on Pentecost, then why would you say it's at hand any time past this portion here? But what we find in Matthew 10 and Matthew 24 is the gospel of the kingdom, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, would be preached until the fall of Jerusalem. That's why the prayer, "Thy kingdom come," wasn't just a 3-year-long prayer. It was a 40-year-long prayer. It's what they prayed throughout their years, looking forward to the time of the full arrival of the kingdom. 40-year long. They did it from about AD 30 to about 70. To see this a little bit further, if you look at Luke chapter 21, Luke 21 is a parallel passage to Matthew 24. If you look at Luke 21, you have all these same things that we read about. There will be signs in the sun and moon and the stars, on the earth dismay among the nations, and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and waves. Hang on just a second, I got it on Daniel size, I just realized that. Let me put it up to TV size. There we go. All right. Men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. They'll see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But if you look down here to verse 31, he says, So you also, when you see these things happening, recognize that the kingdom of God is near. In other words, the arrival of the kingdom was tied into the coming of the Son of Man at the fall of Jerusalem. All right, so when he tells them to go out and preach this message, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, it's not limited to just pre-cross time, but it extends even into post-cross time, all the way up until the fall of Jerusalem. All right? Let's go back to Matthew chapter 10, though, and let's continue on here. He says in verse 8, Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, freely you received, that is, freely you received the ability to do these things, so freely give. He tells them before they go out, they're not supposed to acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats, or sandals, or a staff. For the worker is worthy of his support, or you could say of his wages. And whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it's not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you or heed your words, as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. All right. Let's break this. Well, hang on just a second before we break that down. Let's go back up here for just a moment. Notice this in verse 9 and 10. What he's telling them is the people to whom they were preaching were to take care of them, were to receive them. He didn't want them to carry a big cart with all their stuff. He wanted them to depend on the neighborliness, I don't know, of the people in those different villages. If not, they were supposed to shake the dust off their feet. In other words, just move on. Just move on. But then he says this in verse 15, it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Obviously, what he's talking about here are the people within the land of Sodom and Gomorrah and the people within this city. And so he's letting them know that accompanied with this at-hand coming of the kingdom that he talked about earlier inside the message, right? Accompanied with that is this time of judgment. And so they can either listen to the gospel of the kingdom and respond to it, or they can get ready for judgment, which is kind of what John said in Matthew chapter 3, right? In Matthew 3, John told them the same thing. Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The axe is already laid to the root of the tree. Judgment was coming. And so this is the same message of Matthew 10. See, what happens is we read this expression, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, in verse 7, and we understand what at hand means there. But for some reason, when we get down to verse 15 and we read about the day of judgment, now it's way off in our future. But it doesn't make sense because he's talking about the people there to whom receive this message, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All right. Now here we understand when this refers to. Obviously, it begins during the pre-cross time. They began preaching this message before Jesus died on the cross. You have the 70 that were sent out, right, 2 by 2. But listen to what he says in verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my name's sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. Now, before we get into that last little phrase there in verse 18, who was the first Christian martyr? Stephen. Acts chapter 7. That's right. And so, Stephen, in Acts chapter 6 and 7, he gave this message, and he was brought before the council, and he was tried, and he was not really tried too much. He was actually just brutally put to death. But verse 16 and 17 didn't take place until after the cross. And so this commission is not so limited when you get down into it and you read verses 16 and following. Maybe the first few verses pertain to things prior to the cross, but this moves further into the future. To even see more concerning that, look at verse 18. You'll even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. That didn't start happening until way later in the book of Acts, right? Like with Peter and King Agrippa and Paul and Herod and those other Peter and King Herod and Paul and King Agrippa and Felix and all those other people that we meet later on in the book of Acts. But notice what he says at the end of verse 18. As a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. I thought they weren't supposed to go in the way of the Gentiles. You see, it's looking further into the future. During the pre-cross time, supposed to stay in Jerusalem and Judea. Don't go to Samaria. Don't go outside of the land. But later on, now we see that the message extends even to the Gentiles. What are your thoughts on verses 16 through 18? Oh, well, thank you. But it extends further than we used to think. It's talking about post-cross period. And that means that message of the kingdom of heaven is at hand is included in the post-cross period of time. All right? What else you got? All right. You'll even be brought before governors and kings for my sake. When did they first get brought before governors and kings? When did they first get brought before governors and kings? The disciples. And later on in the book of Acts, like with Paul and King Agrippa, right? And so this is not referring to before the cross, because the only person, they weren't even persecuted before the cross. At least we don't have any record of it. Certainly people didn't like them, but nobody scourged them in their synagogues and things like that, like happened later on in the book of Acts. That didn't happen until after, Peter and the apostles were arrested earlier on in the book of Acts, but Stephen was the first one to die. And so when he says, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles, I see that, why did Paul so much want to go before Caesar and before King Agrippa? Why didn't he just want to be tried by the Jews and kept where he was? Roddy's trying to get the message out there. In fact, he said, I wish that you all were like I was, except for these chains. And then King Agrippa said, almost thou persuades me to be a Christian. And so one of the points of getting into these courts and being tried was to demonstrate, the truthfulness of the gospel. Be saved. All right, so I want to show a couple things here. This passage, it is the one who endures to the end who will be saved. Go to Matthew 24 again. Also, this part about brother rising up against brother. All right. Okay, so in Matthew 24 and verse 13, first of all, he says, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. So what we have, the end, in Matthew 24 and verse, what was that, 13, 12, 13? The one who endures to the end will be saved. The end there is the same end of Matthew chapter 10 and verse 22. It is the one who endures to the end that would be saved. The end that he's discussing there, of course, is the end of the age. He's going to bring this up several times in the book of Matthew. There's another writer in the New Testament who says that quite often. The one who endures to the end, the same will be saved. Who is that? John in Revelation 2 and 3. Which really, Jesus speaking through John, but the same subject is discussed there quite often. All right, let's go to Mark 13. In Mark 13, we have a passage here that correlates to Matthew 24. It's Jesus' Sermon on the Mount of Olives. And the scripture says, brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he'll be saved. You see the correlation between those two passages? See, it's referring to a post-cross period of time. The one who endures to the end, he will be saved. It's talking about the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the age. All right, now here's the big one in Matthew chapter 10. Let's look at verse 23. But whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. In this passage, he is not speaking of their preaching the gospel in all these cities, if you read it closely. He's talking about them fleeing from one city to the other, being persecuted. In other words, Jesus was going to come, regardless of the way that you look at it, Jesus was going to come again before they would die. You, he says, these disciples, you're going to flee from one city to the next before the Son of Man comes. So the Son of Man would come within their generation, within their time. All the disciples in the first century, they may flee from one town to the other, like Paul did even among the Gentile cities. And yet Jesus would come before they could be extinguished. That expression, until the Son of Man comes, if my thing would work here, let's see, is found often. It's taken, though, from the book of Daniel chapter 7, by the way, until the Son of Man comes. Daniel 7, particularly verse 13. But look at Matthew 16, 27 and 28, the passage I told you a moment ago. For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I don't know why we differentiate the coming of the Son of Man here, but from the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom. It's the same coming. And you saw that in Luke 21. When you see these things, know that the kingdom is at hand. It's Jesus coming in his kingdom. And so, the Son of Man coming in his kingdom would take place before some of them would taste death, before the disciples would be chased from city to city. So again, this is how you know it's talking about a post-cross period of time. The transition there is evident once you look at all the context in Matthew 10. All right. Does anybody have any comments or questions about this? The not-so-limited commission? Nope. All right. Let's get down to verse 24. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign the members of his household? In other words, you understand that they're going to mistreat me, and they have mistreated me. So don't be surprised when it happens to you. You're not above me. He says, but you're like me, and I'm not treated well, and neither are you. And so he says in verse 26, therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. He's specifically talking here about the gospel, as you see in verse 27. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. So he's letting them know, don't be afraid of those that are going to persecute you. I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know. Everything is going to be revealed. Don't you worry. So he says to them, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell, or in Gehenna. So what he's warning them here in verse 28 is about judgment. Is he's saying these people can do something to your body, but you should rather fear the one who can do something to your soul. You should fear the one who can judge you entirely, not just these individuals who judge you falsely by external things. Fear him who's able to judge you by internal things. In other words, he wants them to have more reverence towards God than they have towards those who would wish to persecute them. Okay? This passage here is, of course, misunderstood. But the word destroy there, when we see it used elsewhere in the scripture, as we are going to, if you look at Matthew 2 and verse 13, for instance, Herod says, or rather, this is said of Herod, now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. This is talking about complete and total destruction, is it not? Herod wasn't going to eternally, consciously punish little baby Jesus forever and ever and ever throughout eternity, right? But it's talking about a complete and total destruction. That's what Herod wants to do. That's his goal. And so in Matthew 10:28, when we read about who destroys both soul and body in hell, we're talking about something, in my opinion, that extinguishes, that destroys. It's not like the burning bush that burns and burns and burns and is not consumed, but it's like a fire that consumes. All right, let's look at verse 29. Go for it. Right. It's a geographical. You have to look at it from the geography. So the word there is Gehenna, Matthew 10:28, and Gehenna was an actual place right outside of Jerusalem where they burned their garbage. I mean, what he's telling them is, in the ultimate sense, you can either be persecuted by them and submit to that persecution, or you can turn away from the gospel and you can join forces with these guys who just want to rebel against Rome, and you can be, your bodies will be piled up with them outside the gates of Jerusalem, is what he's telling them ultimately. He's warning them about the judgment that's coming upon Jerusalem in this particular verse in Matthew 10:28. In fact, a lot of the hell passages that we read have to do with that. Like the many stripes, few stripes thing, it's talking about judgment at the time of the king's return, or at the time of the landowner's return. And so in this passage, he's threatening them, in a sense. You can be persecuted by these people by doing what I tell you to do, because I'm not going to conceal anything from you. Or you can go and follow their gospel that's incomplete and veiled and is according to the world, and you'll meet doom if you go that way. Same thing as what he says in Matthew 7:13 and 14, that the gate is narrow that leads to life, the gate is wide that leads to destruction. All right, verse 29. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows. In other words, don't worry about these people. God's got you covered. You may lose your life, but you won't lose your soul. God's going to take care of that. All right? And so that's what he says in verse 32 and verse 33. Therefore, everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. And now we get into the real meaning of Matthew 10 and verse 28. Whenever he talks about there in verse 28, to be destroyed, it means that, in a sense, that you have been denied before God who is in heaven because you denied Christ while you were on earth. You have bent to the will of the persecutors and have given up the very gospel message that you've been told to preach. Is the idea there. Now, in verse 34, we have sort of a interesting message from Jesus because it kind of goes against what we typically think and what Jesus typically says. He says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Now what he's doing is he's playing off the conventional ideas of the kingdom. They think he's going to come march against Rome. And so he's told them this whole time, that's not my purpose. It's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring peace. And now what he's doing is he's playing into that whole idea. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And so what would be on the back of their minds is sword, like to chop with. And he says in verse 35, "For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be will be the members of his household." So what he's saying is, it's the gospel message. It's so divisive because it's so different from the way that the world typically works. And so he's sort of playing, it's almost like it's almost like satire in a sense. It's almost like a joke, I didn't come to bring peace, I come to bring a sword. Well, the whole message he's been preaching is, I've come to bring peace. But what he's playing on is that conventional idea of the kingdom, and he's telling them, the type of disruption that I actually have come to bring is not sword against sword in the physical sense, but who's willing to accept the gospel and who's not. They're going to turn against each other because of this message, and people are going to be cast out of their own households because they've decided to live in this certain way. So that's really what he's doing there. There's a lot of places, people that study the Greek a lot point out that Jesus used to tell puns and little jokes all the time. He was always giving little plays on words there. Like that section of scripture, would you ask, if your son asked you for a loaf of bread, would you give him a stone, right? Those sections. Those words apparently are so similar in the pronunciation that he's almost, telling them a joke in a sense. It would have been funny, I don't know how we would do that today, but we do that kind of stuff all the time. We do wordplay and give little smart aleck remarks that are meant to be funny but teach a lesson. And so that's what Jesus is doing here. And so he says in verse 37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And he who has found his life will lose it. And he who has lost his life for my sake will find it. Again, this whole thing comes back down to being dedicated to this gospel message, to the point of, if your father or mother says, don't be a Christian, don't follow this Jesus character, you say, that's what I'm going to do. He's the way, the truth, and the life. I've got to do this for my own good and for the good of those around me. Notice in verse 38, he says, he does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. See, the cross of Jesus is not just something that he's done. It's not just something that he's done on our behalf, but it's something that he invites us to join him in, to take up our cross and to follow him, to put to death our old man. It's not something as if we're over here and Jesus is over there on the cross, but the idea is that we go join him there. What did Paul say in Galatians 2? It's that first little line. I am crucified with Christ. He said later on in the same book, remember, I've been crucified to the world and the world to me. Right? So he looked at the cross not as something to run from, but as something to run towards and to join Jesus, on which he could join Jesus and put to death his old man. And so basically in verse 39, it comes back to this very classic message of James, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. If you're willing to humble yourself, to lose your life, then you'll find it. And he says in verse 39, those who found his life will lose it. In other words, those who reject Jesus in order to abstain from persecution, they're the ones that are going to be denied before the Father, he says. But those who are willing to be persecuted, even if it means losing their own life for the sake of the gospel, they're going to be eternally blessed. And so that's the idea of Matthew 10. 26 all the way, or rather 24 all the way down to 39. Does anybody have any comments on those verses there? All right, let's move on. We'll finish it up here. He who receives you receives me. He who receives me receives him who sent me. What does that remind you of? Acts chapter 9, the Apostle Paul. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Who art thou, Lord? I'm Jesus whom thou persecutest. The other place that this is spoken of is in Matthew 25. When you saw me naked, you clothed me. When you saw me hungry, you fed me. There is an identity between Jesus and his body, Jesus and his church, the people of God. So he says, he who receives you receives me. And that's why, if you want to take this the opposite way, what he's saying is, he who rejects you rejects me, right? He told that to somebody. God told that to somebody in the Old Testament. Do you remember who that was? Samuel, in 1 Samuel 8. Samuel was upset because they wanted a king, and God says, Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. He who receives a prophet, he says in verse 41, in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. In other words, you can participate in the spread of the gospel, not just by telling it to others, but by receiving one who's missionary into your house to sort of let your house be their home base as they go throughout that city and preach. He who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of a cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. The whole point of this, as you see in verse 40 to 41, is to be kind to one another, to love one another, to love your neighbors, and in that way we can participate in this spreading of the gospel message. Does anybody else have any comments on those three verses? That's why when the Mormons came to my house, I offered them a bottle of water and said, "See there, I'm set now. So whatever you tell me, I'm good to go." Oh, yeah? You haven't done that for me once. Okay, all right. Oh, gotcha. So you're not interested in heaven anymore then, Ashley. But the idea is to be hospitable. There is a counter to this, though. Let's go to 2 John. Keith, were you going to say something? All right, let's go to 2 John. In 2 John, he warns this in verse 7. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves, that you do not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. So he says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him a greeting, or bid him Godspeed. For the one who gives him, or bids him Godspeed, or he gives him a greeting, participates in his evil deeds. This is going back to Matthew 10. If you receive a prophet in the name of a prophet, you're doing well. But if you receive someone who's trying to sow discord among the brethren or what have you, then you're actually participating in his evil deeds. So if you can participate in good deeds or you can participate in evil deeds. It's kind of, it goes both ways. All right. Now do we have anything? Is that it? Yes, ma'am.
He was openly rebuking a gospel artist, a big one. And
What do you mean by gospel